The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the most horrific chapters in the history of humanity. It involved the forced transport of millions of Africans across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The primary destination for these enslaved individuals was the Americas. They were brought there specifically for the purpose of forced labor. This labor fueled the economies of European colonies, particularly on plantations. Understanding this history requires a direct confrontation with its brutal realities. It is a history marked by immense suffering, dehumanization, and violence. It fundamentally shaped the modern world. The initial stage of the transatlantic slave trade involved the capture of individuals within Africa. European traders often partnered with certain African kingdoms or individuals. These partners engaged in various methods to obtain captives. This included raiding villages and engaging in warfare against neighboring groups. Captives were obtained through these violent means. Often those captured were innocent civilians, living their lives peacefully before the raids. Once captured, they were forced to embark on a brutal journey to the coast. They were typically shackled together during this arduous march. Many were also branded with hot irons. This marked them as property and instilled terror. The journey to the coast could span hundreds of miles. It was a trek marked by starvation, disease, and relentless violence. Significant loss of life occurred during this initial phase. Many captives perished before ever reaching the slave ships waiting on the coast. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean became known as the Middle Passage. It was a nightmare experience for those forced to endure it. Slave ships were specifically designed to maximize the number of enslaved people carried. This design led to unimaginably inhumane conditions on board. Africans were crammed into the ship's dark, airless holds. They were often packed so tightly they had little to no room to move. They were chained together, often in rows, for the entire voyage. Space was minimal and comfort was non-existent. Sanitation on these vessels was virtually non-existent. The holds were breeding grounds for disease. Rampant diseases spread quickly through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, smallpox, and yellow fever were common killers. Lack of adequate food and water was also a frequent issue. Malnutrition and dehydration weakened the captives further. The psychological trauma inflicted during the Middle Passage was immense. The fear, despair, and loss were overwhelming. A tragically high mortality rate resulted from these horrific conditions. Many died during the voyage itself. Their bodies were callously thrown overboard into the ocean. This was a common practice throughout the Middle Passage. Some individuals, driven to despair by the conditions, attempted suicide. They sought any escape from the suffering. For the survivors, arrival in the Americas brought no end to their suffering. They were immediately subjected to further dehumanization and exploitation. Upon arrival, the enslaved people were typically sold. This often occurred at auctions held in ports. Families who had managed to survive the journey together were frequently torn apart during these sales. Spouses, parents, and children were sold to different enslavers. When sold, enslaved people were forced into brutal labor regimes. The vast majority were sent to work on plantations. Primary crops cultivated through their forced labor included sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These crops generated immense wealth for enslavers and European powers. Enslaved people were subjected to brutal and often sadistic treatment. Violence was a constant threat. This included severe physical abuse and horrific acts of sexual violence. Their bodies were not their own. Basic human rights were systematically denied to them. They were stripped of their dignity and autonomy. Under the law and in the eyes of their enslavers, they were considered property, not people. They were chattel to be bought, sold, and exploited. Their lives were entirely at the mercy of their enslavers. They had no legal recourse or protection. Despite the overwhelming brutality, the enslaved people fought back in numerous ways. Their spirit was not entirely broken. Forms of resistance ranged from subtle acts to outright rebellion. They continually sought freedom and dignity. Cultural preservation was a vital form of resistance. They maintained traditions, languages, and religious beliefs, often in secret. Acts of sabotage were also employed to disrupt the system. This included breaking tools or damaging crops. Many enslaved individuals deliberately slowed down their work. This was a quiet but persistent form of defiance. Planning and attempting escapes was another common act of resistance. The desire for freedom drove many to take immense risks. These acts of resistance were often met with severe and brutal punishment. Enslavers sought to crush any sign of defiance. Yet the continued resistance demonstrated the incredible resilience of the enslaved. They refused to fully submit. Their actions showed an unwavering desire for freedom. This struggle for liberation is a crucial part of their history. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to impact societies today. Its effects are deeply embedded in the fabric of the modern world. It left a lasting mark on the demographics of continents. Populations were shifted and dispersed across the Atlantic. The trade fundamentally shaped economies. It built wealth for some while creating systemic poverty and disadvantage for others. It profoundly affected social structures in the Americas, Europe, and Africa. Racial hierarchies and inequalities were established and reinforced. Understanding the full horrors of this history is crucial. It is necessary for acknowledging the immense injustices of the past. This understanding is vital for working towards a more equitable future. We must learn from history to avoid repeating its mistakes. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths about exploitation, power, and human cruelty. This history is not easy to face, but it also requires recognizing the enduring resilience of those who suffered. Their survival and resistance are testaments to the strength of the human spirit.